hi to everyone who's joining from wherever you are. We really want to make this interactive and, have a conversation with you as well. So, feel free to drop your comments. My colleagues here at Devex are actually going to be posting the questions that we'll be discussing. So feel free to have your say as well. I think you can also use the question box if you have any particular questions that you want us to cover today. But yeah, I think just kind of as a quick introduction to the topic, we've covered kind of the intersection of human rights and digital, a little bit of Devex, but I think Human Rights Day is a great day to, dive deeper into some of these issues and what they mean, especially for young people around the globe. And also shout out, llan, to your organization, Fondation Botnar, for partnering with us on this conversation. So yeah, it's great to have you all here. Yeah, I mean, it's a big conversation. We have to cover a lot of ground, so I'm going to try to keep this little introduction short. But first of all is kind of, why are we here today? What do we want to discuss? And I think, llan, you said something before that, human rights and, and digital rights, they're already intersecting, already affecting lives in the digital sphere for young people and for everyone who's on these platforms. So, they're already having these effects. And of course, there are huge benefits. I think we've probably seen that even more with the COVID-19 pandemic. Classes moved online, health services. There are so many great benefits when it comes to, promoting political participation, exchange of information, and it's kind of finding that balance, right, between safeguarding rights, and ensuring that, freedom of speech is protected. But, managing and regulating some of the risks involved. So I think we're going to have an exciting and, honest conversation about that. And, some of the issues when it comes to privacy breaches and, online bullying and assault, that is a reality for many young folks online, and something that, maybe already some of you are experiencing or have experienced. And then I think another big thing we want to cover is data ownership, kind of this idea of, us users generating a lot of data. We can use these platforms for free, which is great, but then, we kind of pay with our data, and what kind of issues does that create from a human rights perspective? But also the question of equity. Not everyone, looking to low and middle income countries, not everyone can afford, a smartphone, a data plan. And in some places, you just can't access the internet, or it's very slow or very expensive. So those are some of the issues. And I want to keep it brief and really turn it over to you, our experts here today, to hear more. And I think we'll start off with kind of the freedom of speech concept, and that question. But, online platforms and social media networks, they both promote freedom of speech, as we mentioned, but they also kind of regulate the use of speech and information in the sense that algorithms are deciding who gets to see what. So, what kind of problems does that create? And yeah, to what extent is the digital space both promoting but also limiting freedom of speech? Marwa, I know you've been involved with questions of this type a lot, so maybe we can kind of hear from you and then just go around the table and, feel free to just jump in whenever you feel you want to raise a point.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. And I think the question around freedom of expression is really, is really crucial to tackle, because the participation in the online space is not just about being in the online space, but it's more so, of course, exercising your human rights in the online space. And so as long as we don't have a transparent kind of mechanism that actually works for the greater good. And when I say the greater good, I know it's a kind of philanthropic word that it's used by different platforms to just mitigate questions around corporate social responsibility. But at the end of the day, I need to feel and I need to reach my full potential, regardless of who I am, what I am, and what I am sharing. And of course, since we're on the Human Rights Day occasion, we should say that member states need to protect, respect, and fulfill freedom of expression to the extent necessary and proportionate. I know that there are boundaries that I'm not going to speak to, especially when it comes to hate speech and how we can also make sure that we don't allow speech that would impede and harm the exercise of democracy and the rule of law. But at the end of the day, just like I said, I should feel myself in the online space, which is not the case for so many people, just to say so in a vernacular language. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and maneuvering this dichotomy is kind of difficult, I think. We have examples such as the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which really showed, the influence that platforms can have when it comes to the type of information that's showcased, where we had incidents of, actors using fake news to actually influence election results and how people voted. And then the, other side of that coin is kind of the way it really enabled citizens to mobilize protests and share information during the Arab Spring. And, other countries have even been, hosting elections on blockchain. I know India and Brazil and other big countries are kind of looking for electronic voting systems and, how to integrate that more and more. So there's just, there's so much good and there's so much bad. So how do we maneuver that space? Sandhya, maybe you can kind of give us a look from where you sit and from your work at Girl Effect.
I think it's a very interesting question because I usually end up giving a little bit of an anecdote that gets everyone a tad bit surprised. Yes, I think there has not been a time before where young people, disenfranchised people, mostly invisibilized people, anybody in the margins, and this can be gender, class, caste, anything that divides us, have had so much of a space that they can own themselves. And so that's really great to watch and really great to see blowing up a lot, especially here in India. But one of the things that I always talk about is it's a tricky question to answer because I wish I could say that there is so much freedom of speech, but I think young girls, for example, that Girl Effect really reaches out to, they don't speak online. They don't really share anything online. And that's because, Ilan said a very interesting thing, said that what happens offline is the exact same rights that you have to look at online. And those lives are not different. They're the same kind of restrictions that are placed in your life in real time around you, in your physical surroundings, are sort of the same kind of things that girls, especially young girls, are bringing onto the platforms as well. So they don't feel like they have a right to speak. They don't feel like they have the right to own this space. And so maybe the first step is actually to tell them that this space is yours to own. It's your space to take. It's your voice that is valuable to be a part of the noise that is being generated. And maybe after that, it's a conversation of how they use that space and how well they should protect themselves in that space. And this whole idea of encouraging somebody to open up and share is also so scary, because how do you really tell them, speak up, use your voice, when all around them the examples tell them not to? Even more all the time, it's based on trying to dampen those voices down even more. And so you have to fight that much more to be taken seriously or even to just exist. And of course, everything around the digital ecosystem is not built especially for the marginalized. I always say that platforms are not built for anybody but men. They're built by and for men. And when you don't take into account the lived realities and those barriers that you need to be accounting for in that design of the platform, how can you expect there to be equal usage or equity in that space? And I think, it's a tricky question to answer, because the larger macro answer is yes, there's so much freedom of speech and expression. There's been space that's been taken unlike ever before. You take anything that is really causing dissension, discussion, conversation online, and you can see how that space is being used so very, very well. But also when you break down and go into the micros of who's talking, it kind of ends up being the same set of people who've already had privilege and access who are really using that space for their voice. And it's essential to build and break that, make them feel more comfortable about wanting to own that space. So
Yeah, no, definitely. And whose responsibility is it to kind of advance this and sort of break down these barriers? Is it the platforms like Instagram? Is it the regulators, the policymakers that are trying to regulate the space? And all of the above. Llan, do you want to maybe jump in, give us some of your thoughts on that?
Sure. No, I think indeed it is interesting when thinking about these issues to distinguish between the responsibility of the states and the responsibility of companies themselves. And indeed these are different because there's a tendency from different states to actually try to regulate content moderation. So making laws, telling companies what type of content they should delete or not. And I think that this is maybe not actually where the focus of states should be. The focus of states should be in promoting freedom of expression. And actually, it is very important to understand that freedom of expression is the solution to all the problems that we see in terms of hate speech or misinformation and other problematic content that are being spread. So basically, if you want to be able to address all these dangerous contents that is spreading online, the answer is not less but more freedom of expression. Because if you can promote more freedom of expression, then you can promote alternative messages that can allow to respond to this. Because the problem with censorship is that it can create an idea that the messengers were right, because they were able to, they were opposed by censorship, and so it gives legitimacy to what was said. That being said, it doesn't mean that every content should be allowed. Indeed, in international law, especially, there is a very strong prohibition of incitement to violence, in particular. But the question is, how do you get there? And I think this moves the conversation to the responsibility of the companies. And while at the same time you need to have more consistent content moderation, you also need to have some redress and some mechanisms so that people could also if for instance one of your content was taken down, you need to have a way to oppose this and to have this this opposition considered by the companies, because nowadays there is a total lack of transparency in the ways these decisions are taken. And the problem is that companies are not judicial bodies, and they act based on the laws that have not been voted for. So there's really a democratic challenge in the way freedom of expression is being regulated by companies.
Yeah, and kind of just to tie it back to the role of young people, what's the role of young people in, pushing for more transparency in these spaces? Marwa, is that anything?
No, yeah. I think Ilan raised a very interesting point, because and today I am representing a civil society actor, we're stuck in a kind of loophole between the government and the tech companies. Because when you go to the tech companies and you say you need to comply with human rights framework, they would say, we don't work in local jurisdiction. We can't force to change laws. Basically, it's not our job. When you go to governments and you say we need to have a better rule of law in the online space, they would say it's not our platforms, it's theirs. So you just keep playing there in a kind of vain back and forth. And why is it happening? Because simply we don't have transparency reports from both sides. We don't know which conversations happen between the government and the tech companies, especially in authoritarian settings, when it's really hard to get the hang of content moderation in a very kind of hate-net environment. And so if we don't get the data from tech platforms, especially from a contextual kind of perspective, because they only have global metrics, they would only speak of a kind of global stance. They would say, globally, we have GBV, globally, we have this, but locally, we don't know what is happening. And so as long as we don't have the local data, we can't make the case for ourselves against governments in order to change the law. So it should start there. We need to have more transparency and impartial auditing happening from their side. Otherwise, we can't do anything.
Oh, that's great, Marwa. Thank you, Sandhya. Anything you want to add, or should we kind of move on to the data questions?
I actually just really wanted to clap when Mara said that. I think it really, you do need a lot more transparency than we have right now. Um, but the only thing that for me the perspective is not really coming from policies or governments or states, because the view has to be actually towards the young people that we talk to. And honestly, one of the things that Ilan mentioned about moderation is something that's really essential. We are there is a lot of pushing down or dampening of the content that you put out, especially when it's, I don't know why, but overall anything to do with health is almost immediately censored. It's really difficult, especially if it's about women. It gets censored a lot more, a lot faster. Repeals don't work. You have to really circumvent how you're going to get that information out. And it's really problematic, because why should talking about really normal things like menstrual management need censorship at all, ever? Why is information about how and what your body looks like? Because, for example, sex education in our country, and I think most countries, is not particularly great. There was a very interesting video that recently came out that showed a woman's body and broke down what their reproductive system looked like, and it got censored so many times. And all of the comments in that video, all of that comments in that conversation, where I didn't even know there were so many parts, or it extended so much. It was so it's saddening to hear that these are the things that get censored, but also really essential to encourage that if you do feel like talking about it, don't bother about censorship and continue to do so, because you have to take space. It's the unfortunate reality of fighting for your rights, is always to continue to take space and don't get bogged down. And if you need protection, then we'll provide you with layers of protection, but continue to take space. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a super strong call to action. And yeah, I see people have already started to share their opinions, and that's great. Please, we want to hear from you. My colleagues here at Devex are trying to send the questions so that you can, if you just stumble into the conversation, you can kind of catch up and see what we're discussing. And yeah, we actually had someone asking for, more of an agreement between users and social media platforms. I think that's a good segue to our next question around data governance and data sovereignty, really. And I know back in 2017, I think it was, The Economist published this article titled, "The world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data." So we've kind of moved to this era where data is king. It moves just so much information and money and power. And this obviously comes with a set of issues and risks. And platforms such as Instagram that we're on today, they obviously benefit a lot from user data, for their advertisers, and we get to use these platforms for free, but in return we pay with our data. And I kind of wanted to raise, what kinds of human rights issues do you think that that creates when we think about the concentration of such huge amounts of data in a few privately owned hands? What is kind of the implications there when we look at human rights? Just throwing it out there and see who wants to jump in. Well,
I can go.
Go.
But a slightly different skew to the question, if I may.
Of course.
I think the topic around data sensitivity, ethical use of data, respectful use of data is really important, and it needs to be part of anything that you conceptualize. You need to start with the idea that if you're going to use anything that gives you data, what is the respectful and ethical way of doing it? But having said that, I think the first part that I always hear back, or I think about, is how many of the really young people who are on the platforms and driving these platforms even know what it means to have a safe space where their data is ethically or respectfully used. And so in this conversation about privacy and respectful use, what ends up happening is it's again just shut down. Somebody else is taking the decision for them, as opposed to trying to find out how they can be involved in that conversation of what data they want, they're okay with being used, as opposed to just this baseline expectation that you're on a platform and your data is automatically used. which is I think how everybody enters into any social space, is that they assume that, oh, of course my data is going to be used right now. So I have, this is the, this is the barter that I have to give. I can't do anything about it. We'll be bombarded with ads that I don't want, or I want, or whatever. And it's really interesting because in GE and in India as well, we do use the tools that platforms give us to reach out to our audience, simply because the audience that you reach out to organically are the ones who are most privileged, with the most access, with the most time, with the most money. So it will never reach the audience that you actually are designing with and for. So you have to find them. But that doesn't mean that the minute you do that process of going out and reaching out to them, that you just invariably hold all of that data. Like, we make it a point to tell them what it means, what is it that we're collecting. If we tell them, you can back out at any minute, even if after you've given us consent. We tell them about, we're ready to delete everything that we might have about you in entirety, and we're okay. That might have implications on program design and how your program's impact is measured, but it has to be secondary to how the person that you're trying to actually elevate or help enable that elevation for feels about it. So I think for me, the first question is, do they know? Are they involved in that conversation? And maybe the first step is to involve them in it before decisions are being made. Otherwise, we keep talking about agency and choice, but they get none of it when it comes to the conversation around data. So yeah, that's a slight skew.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. Llan, Marwa, do you want to maybe jump in with your point of view there as well?
Yeah, I can jump in. So I have a popular opinion. I'm not a data enthusiast, and I know there are a lot of data enthusiasts out there, but I don't think data is the new all. I think data centers are the new all. And by saying so, we say and we assume that so many tech platforms that have become like governments, basically. They're new governments. I call them the country meta. It's not a platform. And so by saying so, we actually just not only use our data, but just shape the future that we want to see right now, or that they want to see right now. Because just having a kind of bird's eye view of everyone's on the planet and what they're doing and what they're feeling and what they're liking, what they're not liking, and how they're shaping it into right now into that kind of metaverse is mind-blowing. I think it's one of the most mind-blowing things that history has ever witnessed. And perhaps because we don't speak the same language, people don't really get the challenge that we are currently facing. It's not just about your data being used. It's also about, for instance, how data centers are so extractivist and how they harm the environment. Just talking about climate justice in terms of how these data centers are being used. The amount of energy they use is just appalling, to say the least. So for me, we should talk about power concentration behind data centers and behind data governance, but also how we coin the term of sovereignty gives a lot of power to the state because it becomes state-backed. It doesn't really have a kind of right-centered focus. And this is the contentious issue in data governance right now. We're just having numbers jumping into the void. So even in terms of youth participation, we would say that we have young people between 18 and 30 participating in that and doing that. But at the end of the day, we don't have a kind of governance that really foresee decisions that would work for these young people. And that's what makes it different. Yeah, I hope I made sense.
A lot of sense, very strong sense. No, that's great. Thank you so much, Marwa. And Llan, from a kind of human rights perspective, what kind of issues does this create? And what would you add to what's been said in the sense of so much power being concentrated and how we can approach that and kind of improve democracy in that sense almost?
Yes. I think that people are not aware of the amount of data that is taken away from them. I think that if instead of a company it will be a person, being on your shoulder, looking everything you do on your phone, people will not really be very happy about it, right? But because this is all digitalized, in some way it loses this sense of reality. I think also digital literacy is fundamental. People who use digital technology need to understand the way these platforms function. So, other colleagues here have spoken about the data extractivist feature of these technologies, and basically this is linked to the business model. The more data that they extract, the clearer image they can have on you, and then the higher price they can charge in terms of advertisements. And so basically, data becomes the fuel for this type of platform economy as part of this wider system that has been called surveillance capitalism, because it's capitalism by using the data through surveillance of users of these technologies. And this comes with a lot of human rights implications that are very, very worrying. One is linked to what we have spoken before in the first part of the discussion about freedom of expression. So basically, in order to get the most data from you, you need to have the most engagements. You need to have, these companies are trying to make you basically addicted to the services, make you spend the most possible time on these services in order to get the most possible data. But one way to do that is by focusing on this dangerous extreme content, because it has been proven that this is really a content that is the one that creates the most engagement. And basically this creates, echo chambers, a lack of consensus reality where people don't agree on what reality is about, political polarization, far-right extremism and racism, sexism, you name it. Basically, it really creates a threat to democracy. And it is really important to be aware of that, because we are speaking now of the companies that are the companies with the highest capitalization in the world. It's not just something at the margin of our global economy, but something that is really at the center and that is leading the global economy. So just to understand how important these considerations are. So in terms of human rights, we have spoken about freedom of opinion, the freedom that everyone should have to form opinions independently, that is being challenged. There is a lot of problems linked to mental health, obviously, with certain, for instance, on social media, certain images of what a good life should be, and that creates mental health issues for a large number of users. Then you have, obviously, we've spoken about the risk of incitement to violence, especially against women, against minorities, journalists. It can be used as well by member states, by states, to target political opponents as well. So yeah, I think these are all basically consequences of the main human rights challenge that we are speaking now, which is the right to privacy that is not being respected. And I think it is important then to think, what can we do to protect privacy, right? And it seems that it is not enough for companies to themselves speak about some solutions that they should be able to take, because this is, as we have spoken, this is really at the core of the business model. And so this is why, at least at Fondation Botnar, we are advocating for global governance system that will regulate the use of data, the storage of data, and digital technology and AI systems as a whole. And there are some interesting initiatives out there. We can think, for instance, at the European level, there is this new AI Act that is being developed by the European Commission. UNESCO recently, for instance, issued recommendations on data ethics that clearly says that certain application of AI should be completely abandoned. For instance, like the social credit system that, for instance, is taking place in China, and others. So there's really certain application of artificial intelligence that should be left aside. And then in terms of data, this should be regulated, so that the business model will shift, and it's not about extracting the most data possible, but the least data necessary. And based on that, the question will be, what do we do with this data, and how people who are giving away the data can also benefit from this data. So we need to think of certain forms of redistribution from the profit that is being made by the data to those who actually owned it in the first place.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And just also wanted to kind of weave in the conversation with some of the people that we've got joining here, in the sense of, do you actually think about protecting your own data when you're online? And, for everyone on the screen with me as well, is that something that you're kind of consciously aware of? Because, we've already talked about, it comes with realizing what some of the issues are, and being aware. Simply, I know, for example, my dad was about to order a Christmas gift for my mom online, but then he got fed up and kind of upset about all of the information that this company asked him for, so he just asked me to order it instead. But do you also think about like the data that you're putting out there? Are you actively kind of considering that when you're faced with an online form, or something asking for your date of birth, your gender? Do you actively kind of consider where this is going and what you're contributing to? And that, please type your answers as well to everyone who's joining.
I do and I don't, if I have to be honest. I think in some cases where they ask for a lot of information, it just immediately freaks me out, and I leave and move from that space. But like I said, I think it's also quite ingrained, because your base is that data is just going to get taken if you want to use anything, and if everything has to be online, then what's the option? But I think it's what's interesting, or what I try to do, is at least find out about ways in which I don't have to keep giving that data. There's a, maybe not connected, but a little bit of an anecdote that we got about 2.5 years back, and we keep getting that from young girls that we keep talking to, because of this whole fear around your identity and information about your identity being publicly available when you use digital platforms. They invariably end up creating fake profiles that have wrong information. So everything in that profile is false, and it just allows them the freedom to not have to give their own information, but yet go and scroll. I mean, at the face of it, it sounds smart, but it also comes from the idea of trying to protect yourself in case somebody does utilize or pick up the same device that you're sharing with somebody else to access, because women in general do not own phones. And so how do you keep yourself safe? I think there are inherently, with women especially, and with marginalized communities, the idea of protecting your identity is quite ingrained already, because you know that the smallest of the things that you do is going to have a ripple effect that can have very extreme results. And so that sometimes does come over onto the digital ecosystem as well. But I don't think there's anybody really talking to the masses about what it means to keep themselves safe. And llan said that absolutely right, that digital literacy is just very low. So sometimes it's really important to just go and remind them that block, report, private, all of that is acceptable, and it's not going to result in like a negative impact in maintaining your identity, your space of believing in creating a safe space for yourself. And you don't have to always give up that safe space if you need access to something. And I think that's a good lesson to learn from really young people.
Yeah, and I would like to jump in on that point, because it's very important to really highlight, when we speak of protection, we really need to mention explicit consent and the right to information. We cannot put the onus of safety and protection on users themselves. And that's what tech platforms are doing. They're leaning towards that kind of approach of help yourself, protect yourself. We have our community guidelines, we have our reporting mechanisms, and we have the agreements, the 3-page agreement that they make you sign on. and then you can just help yourself. But this is not how it works, and this is a very important right that people don't really understand and don't really conceptualize, that the right to explicit information should be given. So if I have a platform, I need to tell you that I will be taking A, B, C, D from you. It has to be said. I don't have to search for that. And I have to hold people and all the stakeholders accountable for that. Specifically in settings, for instance, in the EU, they have the GDPR. But for instance, in the Arab region, we don't have that. So how can we actually work for consumers' rights, for users' rights, without these mechanisms? So we need to ensure that we have explicit consent. And these consents should be based on an informed consent, which means that we need to educate people, which means that we need to invest in digital literacy, and which means also that we need to invest in transparency reports in order to say to people that you have this, do you agree to that? And then if they do, we can put the onus of safety on them. But until that, and until the world would be an equitable kind of space where everyone is educated, we can't take the onus of safety on ourselves, because this is pure madness. And things change, like the algorithm change every day. So how can we keep, how can we just keep up with the pace? But at the same time, how can we educate ourselves when the information is not available? And if it is, it's just available in English, it's available for the global north, let alone that these systems have been built in the Silicon Valley. These community guidelines are made by white men, basically. So it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Yeah, it should be dealt with a structural change.
Absolutely. Yeah. I heard someone else say, kind of use the phrase of tech bros a few weeks ago in this context, and saying just how much power they have. And it was a conversation just on this topic, actually, where some young leaders were actually saying, well, if these young tech bros, they're young enough to crack this code and to build this code, then they're young enough to regulate this as well. So, there was also kind of a strong call to action to get more young people involved when it comes to informing regulation and having a seat at the table. So yeah, and that's, a really important aspect as well. And I think one of the people joining here actually agrees just with what you were saying, Marwa, in the sense of, we actually need to know that we need that transparency. We need to know what kind of data these platforms are using. So yeah, thanks to everyone for sharing your comments. Keep doing that. We really want to hear from you. And just to give you a background, this conversation kind of is hosted with Devex together with Fondation Botnar, and it's really, the idea is to hear from young people and then inform a content series that we're launching next year. So we really want to kind of see what are some of the key concerns and topics that you all think of when it comes to the intersection of digital rights and human rights. So, we want to make sure this is not just a one-day conversation, but to, keep this going. So yeah, maybe actually, we still have a few more minutes here, but for everyone who's joining, maybe you could start thinking already, what is this one thing that you think is a really important topic or a really important theme that we can't miss? So maybe just take notes of it, and then I'll ask you to post that later so we can kind of jointly see what you're all thinking. But next, I kind of wanted to also just go back and drill a little bit deeper into the issue of privacy. And I know there was a cyber attack in Israel a few weeks ago where an LGBTQ dating site was hacked. And a lot of information and really sensitive and intimate details about a lot of people's sex lives and photos were leaked online. And in other countries where same-sex relationships might be illegal, that could have potential deadly consequences. So breaches to privacy, some folks have even called these cyber wars, and but they have real consequences for people and their lives. And a lot of sensitive information is out there. There's people's HIV status, sensitive health information, just a lot of sensitive information that needs that protection and privacy. And, do you think most platforms respect privacy enough? What needs to improve there? What are some of the concerns that we really, really should be focusing on, and that, both regulators and young people should pay attention to. Let's see who wants to join in. If not, I'll nominate Llan. Let's hear from you quickly.
I think the the example that you gave is not necessarily, because of a lack of respect for privacy on the part of this Israeli dating websites. As you mentioned, it's a consequence of cyber warfare at a higher level, between Israel and Iran in that regard. I think what it shows is that a lot of infrastructure that are online are actually very vulnerable to this type of attacks. But it's not just a small local website like this one. We have seen also other facilities that are state facilities in the global north that have been also suffered similar attacks. Even here where I am in Switzerland, there was actually an article in the newspaper last week on a lot of companies in Geneva that then pay money to the cyber attackers. So this I think shows really the importance of a greater cyber security, and that needs to be really integrated in the way this company do business, but as well any state facility as well. But obviously, this indeed, I mean, we can speak about the duty of the states to protect, and in that case, there will be a need to protect the citizens and the population from having the data breached that way by foreign powers, etc. But I think maybe here the answer is maybe more technical in that context.
Yeah, and maybe we could kind of explore that relationship a bit between, protecting privacy and protecting human rights, because they do go hand in hand in many senses. Marwa, maybe you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think here the issue, regardless of what really happened, is because first, for me, human rights are not sufficient, because if we speak of the rights of women, but also the rights of people of diverse genders and sexualities, the rights of marginalized groups, even a human rights centered approach is not enough. We need more, and perhaps we need a more intersectional perspective. Because just in a very simple language, of course, we didn't design injustice, but we didn't design systems to combat it from the get-go. So if we assume that these systems are going to be used by vulnerable people and communities, then we should assume that we need to protect them so they don't get outed online, or their sensitive data don't get leaked, basically. But we didn't do that because we didn't think that they even exist, which means that the right to privacy really comes from a system, again, that wasn't designed to combat injustice and inequalities and work for really the people in the rock bottom, and not just the people, the privileged ones. So I think when we talk about the right to privacy, we should also talk about how we can make sure that any kind of amendments that we bring really would take an intersectional perspective. Because yes, humans have the right to privacy, but at the end of the day, we need to really look at the context. If sexual relationships outside of marriage are illegal in a setting, then we cannot ask women, for instance, to go report against the sharing of their intimate images, because that's pure craziness. If they would go and do that, they would get jailed, right? And it's the same things. If in a setting we have illegal, some sort of criminalized sexual orientation, then we cannot create a system that would make the data get leaked, basically. And so, speaking of which, we would need an intersectional perspective based on human rights, because at the end of the day, we spent years to prove that women's rights are human rights. So human rights were made for men at the end of the day, and that's just my stance.
Great. I love that you bring in the topic of intersectionality. And Sandhya, maybe we can hear from you. I know for Girl Effect, safeguarding of digital rights and privacy is a really, really big thing. Maybe you have some, concrete lessons learned on, that you could be sharing.
Yeah, I think first is sometimes people don't really outrightly state that they want a sense of privacy around the conversations that they really do want to have. And I think Marwa is so right. If around you everything in your ecosystem and your surrounding is punitive or punishing you for speaking up about things that are supposed to be absolutely normal, the idea of encouraging them to do it requires that much more thought, that much more of putting yourself in harm's way, especially on public platforms. So one of the things that I think we've tried to do, I will refrain from talking about how successful or not, because I don't think anything in a very small capacity is success. It's just a step to design better. Uh, Especially around, and we realized this a while back, especially around, I keep coming back to this because I think amongst all of the things that Girl Effect tries to talk about, talking about sexual and reproductive rights is health and rights is just turning out to be a lesson in just how much censorship or just how much of pushing back or just how every individual woman, anybody who identifies as one, or anybody who is part of this marginalized, vulnerable community, how they feel about it. I think it's essential, like Marwa said, it's essential to design with that privacy in mind. So, for example, we don't overtly encourage anybody to share a story that might potentially put them in trouble. Instead, what we did was we listened to a lot of the girls that we were talking to, and they were so uncomfortable to talk to us publicly, and they were talking to us only on DMs. And we knew that this one-on-one conversation in DMs is not sustainable because no program that we create is the solution. The community is the solution. So it was essential for us, for example, to find out within these spaces that might be highly public, what can create a sense of safety or privacy. And for example, a really, really simple solution is that when you use a closed Facebook group or a private Facebook group, there's no data collection that even Facebook does in it. You can't enter into it without an invitation. You have to send in a request. You'll be judged on the answers you provide. And then based on how you continue to respond inside of it, how much of the safety are you maintaining inside the group is also then taken care of. So we created these different pockets of like as much as possible safe spaces. But I think the thing that we did was we actually went to the girls and we said, if you leave it up to us, the moderators, the admin, the enablers of the space to moderate it all the time, it's not going to work out because we're also human, we'll make mistakes, things will get missed out, we're not available 24/7. So we just completely told them that this is your space. If you feel unsafe, anytime you say it, we will pay attention. We will not ridicule you. We will not say, oh, but you're kidding, or oh no, but what is the proof? Everything's taken seriously, and that's all right. The minute that you keep telling them that their voice matters and that their safety and privacy is at the center of what you're designing for, and not your own profit or forwarding of yourself, I think that automatically does create this sense of realizing. And the very interesting part in that is girls decide whether they want to share or not. Nobody forces them to. If they feel like they want to share, they'll share. If they want to delete it, they delete it. Nobody pushes anybody to come back and say, tell me about it. So it's a really nice little bubble that is a little unreal, that does not reflect the outside world, outside of these safe spaces. But I think the hope is the more that these bubbles of safety, respectful use of data, of privacy that they have experienced and own themselves, the demand for it will increase. And I think it's when a lot of these voices come together, and when I say demanding for it, I don't always mean that everybody is going to be part of the movement physically. I sometimes think that it's very interesting just to see how you would just enable a conversation they're having with a friend who's also not thought about it. And so you'll end up thinking about, oh, but yeah, why isn't somebody asking me whether I want to share my story? Why are they taking my story and making it something else, right? So I think it's an interesting dichotomy of saying that we need to be respectful of their privacy, of course, but I think the answer also is a little bit amongst those with a little privilege or organizations that are looking to work with vulnerable communities is to actually listen to them and design smaller versions of it. I don't think anybody is going to be able to design something that's going to counter any of the social media platforms or digital ecosystem, but to show a little bit of utopia, at least a slightly more equitable digital life would be an interesting thing to see how that flows everywhere else.
Well, thank you. No, I think, we all need those messages of optimism as well. And yeah, just going back to before when I asked you all to have a think about, what is the one thing or theme that you think we should really be covering when it comes to the intersection of human rights and digital rights, feel free to drop it in the comments now. And, we really want to hear from you in the sense of the issues that you're concerned about. And speaking about privilege, I wanted to get back to the question of equity, which has been raised already, I think, throughout our conversation today. But really kind of with an eye on the pandemic that has really, really highlighted the role of inequalities on, both social and economic levels, and the role of internet access. Many classes moved online, health services. It's really widened both the digital divide, but the data divide as well. And I know I was looking at some data around this, and I think only 20% of people in least developed countries have internet access, so, and when they do, oftentimes it's very slow, it's very expensive. So it's, easy to assume that, we all have our smartphones and we can connect and get, access to information and health services and education, but that's not always the case. So with an eye on, this inequality and exclusion that it also creates, I kind of wanted to throw out the thought-provoking question in the sense that, do you think internet access should be considered a human right?
Yeah, I can maybe say a few words about that. So yes, access to the internet should be considered a human right because it derives from well-established and well-accepted human rights, such as the right to freedom of opinion and expression that we've spoken about quite extensively, which entails the right to seek, receive, and impart information, which nowadays is, very central, for which it is essential to have internet access. Also, access to the internet, as you said, is needed in order to access other human rights, such as the right to education, which is especially important for young people. I think it is interesting to say regarding the figure that you've just mentioned. 20% of young people, 20% of people in least developed countries have access to the internet, which is 4 times less than in the rest of the world. But even in least developed countries, people under the age of 25 still have twice more, proportionally access to the internet as other generations. So I think this shows really that there is a move in the right direction for young people. But of course, we need to do much more to guarantee this access to the internet for everyone. And I just wanted maybe to make reference to a very important UN report that came out last year for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And then that was taken in this important report called Our Common Agenda that really sets out what the UN intends to do for the future. And in this report, it is really written that universal access to the internet is a human right. So I think there is actually a strong consensus in the international community to really put these discussions into a human rights discourse.
Yeah, and what can really be done to promote access? Marwa, Sandhya, do you have any kind of own experiences that you could share there?
Yeah, perhaps I can jump in, and I would just add to what llan said. I think access should be promoted as a political right and not just as any human right. It is a political right, so that states have to abide by this right and comply with this right with all, regardless of their means. Political rights, always have to be protected, fulfilled, and respected, regardless of the means that the states have. And they need to put incentives into this in order to, just mind the gap and the silos that we have, global, north, south, and everything. And speaking to that, I think with all the alarming figures, having 2 billion women or offline worldwide, which is huge, 2021, and 2 billion women are offline. Speaking of 70% of Africa's population offline, 70% in the youngest continent that the history has ever witnessed, 70% are offline. The other 30% are struggling to get mobile data, to get the hang of meaningful connectivity, to secure bandwidth and decent coverage. So I think if we speak of what should be done, it should be done to local context, because I'm seeing like people, decision makers speaking of 5G in remote places. This is so straining. And this is so absurd, to say the least. So we need really to think of our infrastructure in a contextual kind of perspective. So we don't just get any kind of solution and replicate it there just because it was successful in the global north, or it has shown, best practices, whatever. So any infrastructure that we think of has not to be straining, and at the same time has to be built by the community, such as community networks, which is a community-led internet that has shown its success in so many remote places in Africa. And this is something that decision maker has just to follow suit on.
Thank you. Well, we're kind of running out of time. This hour just went by really, really quick. But yeah, thank you so much for joining. It's been, really, really interesting and great to learn so much from all of you. So thanks for spending this hour of Human Rights Day with us. And thanks to Fondation Botnar for partnering with us on this initiative. As I mentioned, we'll be writing much more on this topic starting next year. So, follow Devex, check out the rest of the coverage that will come out next year if you're interested in these topics. And thanks also for, sharing your comments. We'll hopefully be able to save this down and look through some of those comments more carefully. But yeah, thank you so much again. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be with you all in this digital space today. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.